Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
All right, well, I want to thank you all for coming, particularly those of you who showed up early because you came twice. Those of you who didn't come early, there was a fire alarm around 7:24. And so those of you who were here before that, you came and then you came back, so thank you. And thank you, Justin, for the very kind introduction. Every time I'm introduced, I'm reminded of an anecdote of a very celebrated speaker who was introduced at a conference as a speaker who, quote unquote, needs no introduction. And the speaker was apparently very gratified by this compliment, and so he proceeded to give his comments for the evening, which exceeded by a considerable margin the time that had been allotted for his talk. And so after a while, one of the audience members started to storm out in disgust, and they stopped at the door, and they turned around, and they said to the speaker, "Sir, it may be that you need no introduction, but it certainly seems to me that you are in dire need of a conclusion." And so I will try to honor your time tonight and keep my comments brief. So tonight we are going to be talking about the relationship between reason and faith. And just to frame the discussion a little bit more closely, when I talk about reason, I'm primarily going to be talking about reason as it relates to natural science, because that's the branch of philosophy that I happen to know the most about. And when I talk about faith, I will primarily focus on Christian faith, because again, that's the faith tradition that I know the most about. That's not to say that there aren't similar points and interesting points that could be made involving, say, social sciences or other faiths, but other speakers are going to be more qualified to address those kinds of questions. Not that if you have those questions, you can't toss them out to me, but I'll sort of stick to what I know. Now, the popular perception of science and faith is that they oppose or even contradict one another. And so when people find out that I'm a chemist and also a Christian, I often get puzzled looks and questions like, well, doesn't that cause a lot of problems for you? To which my honest answer is, well, no, not really. And so when I dig a little bit deeper, I usually find that these kinds of questions are based on some kind of a misconception. Misconception on the one hand of what science offers us, and misperception on the other hand of what religion requires of the believer. And so before we talk about how faith and science can be integrated, I think it's worthwhile for us to address these kinds of misconceptions to get them out of the way so that they don't color our discussion later on. So misperceptions about science, misconceptions about faith. First, let's talk about the misconceptions about science. I've got three that I want to cover. And the first misconception I'd like to discuss is the idea that being a good scientist necessarily means that you're going to become an atheist. This argument has been championed, in particular by folks like Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett, the folks who call themselves the quote-unquote new atheists, or as I like to call them, the evangelical atheists. The idea seems to be that in becoming a scientist, the repeated application of rational observation will somehow cure you of your misguided notion of faith. Now, like all misperceptions we will discuss tonight, there's a kernel of truth here. And the kernel of truth is that being a good scientist requires being an objective observer. If I do some experiments and collect data, and then I analyze that data in a biased way, for example, by deleting the data points that are not consistent with the conclusion I want to draw, the result is not simply bad science, it is not science. Or to take another example, if I ran a chemical reaction and found I got 125% yield, I might sit down and say, well, look at that. God suspended the law of conservation of mass in the middle of my organic chemistry lab. Awesome. God, it's a miracle. I deserve an A++ on this assignment. And this would not be science. We all recognize that because my bias, namely my desire to get a good grade in organic chemistry, led me to discard a plausible explanation, namely that I had mismeasured the starting materials at the beginning of the lab, in favor of a less plausible explanation. And doing science requires me to report and analyze my data in a way that God is less biased than believing in God. And so, to be a good scientist, you must be an atheist, QED. But that argument goes off the rails quite quickly because atheism is every bit as biased a position as theism. Science can no more prove the existence of God than it can prove the non-existence of God. And so we would appear to be stuck from the point of view of science, because on the one hand we have atheism, on the other hand we have theism, and both are biased. But this really should not shock us, because scientists are biased in any number of ways. Spiritually, emotionally, intellectually, we all have baggage that we bring into the lab. And the secret to being a good scientist isn't that you must somehow become some skeptical, unfeeling robot that just runs experiments. The secret is to learn to be able to set aside your personal biases when you go into lab so that you can perform objective scientific testing. And so being an atheist provides no particular advantage and no particular disadvantage to being a scientist. So that's the first misperception I wanted to cover. The second misperception is the idea that science is making God irrelevant. And here the argument goes something like this. It says that in ancient times we needed God. We needed him in order to explain a whole host of things that we could not otherwise understand, things like thunder and drought and disease. However, now science teaches us how all of these things can be explained in terms of chemistry and physics and biology. And so we find that we need God less and less and less. And eventually, we just won't need God at all. This point of view is often known as the God of the gaps approach to the interaction of science and faith, and it's incorrect. And the key fallacy that is at work here is the idea that somehow God only exists in those phenomena that science cannot explain. That somehow the expansion of scientific knowledge necessarily squeezes God into smaller and smaller gaps in our knowledge. And the reality is that God is not a God of the gaps, but the God of everything. And the truth is that as science gets bigger, God gets bigger, or at least our understanding of him gets bigger. So because the Christian view is that God pervades everything, both the things that science can explain and the things that it cannot explain. And so, for example, the fact that I can look into the sky at the North Star and point to it and say, that star is actually a collection of 5 astronomical bodies that are about 434 light years away from planet Earth. That evidence, those facts, don't detract from the majesty of the God who created those astronomical bodies and set them into motion. And it certainly doesn't detract from my wonder at God. So that was the second misconception that you encounter a lot. The third one is the idea that science is the path to certainty. And this is going to be probably the most important point, most important misperception for tonight, so I'll dwell on it for a moment. Because on some level, it is natural to think that science is the only way to really be certain about something. After all, science is based on evidence, things we can examine and measure, and as they say, seeing is believing. And people who promote this view often characterize faith as some kind of flimsy guesswork, something that doesn't really lead to certainty at all, something that's really only worthwhile if you have no evidence to resort to. Now, the reality is, of course, scientific evidence can increase our confidence in a proposition, but this is the key point, confidence is not the same as certainty. As the saying goes, you can tell a person that there are 300 sextillion stars in the universe, and he'll believe you. But you tell that same person that a bench is covered with wet paint, and he'll need to touch it to be sure. Because there's a difference between confidence and certainty. And it is only in pure mathematics that reason is enough to get us to certainty. In the natural world, it rarely works out so neatly. In most situations, there is evidence that supports a given hypothesis and evidence that goes contrary to your hypothesis. As Richard Feynman once said, in science, we have found it of paramount importance that in order to progress, we must recognize ignorance and leave room for doubt. Scientific knowledge is a body of statements of varying degrees of certainty, some most unsure, some nearly sure, but none absolutely certain. Because even for a theory with no known exceptions, in science we must always be wary. Because it's always possible that the next bit of data, the next observation will contradict our theory and prove it wrong. You know, that classical mechanics will eventually give way to quantum mechanics, or that Newton will eventually give way to Einstein. So that the reality is that historically speaking, science has led to great advances in human knowledge, but no significant advances in certainty. We'll come back to that point a little bit later, but now I want to just move on and talk about some of the misperceptions people have about faith. I've just got two to discuss here. The first one that I want to talk about is a big one. It's the idea that having faith means you can't believe in fill in the blank. And I'm leaving a blank there so that you can fill it in with whatever controversial scientific topic you want to put there: evolution, the Big Bang, dinosaurs, you name it. And this is a big one. And so I feel like we should get this out on the table first, because there is, I think, a general fear that becoming a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew requires not only accepting God, but also accepting a whole host of other propositions that run counter to scientific evidence. Now, again, there is a kernel of truth here. And the kernel of truth is that, historically speaking, there are any number of topics over which the church and science have been at odds. You know, how old is the earth? What is the origin of species? Does the earth revolve around the sun, or the sun about the earth? And in Christianity, most of the arguments with science are based off of the readings of biblical scriptures. And now, as a Christian, I believe that the Bible is true. I believe that it is free from error. And the Bible does contain a great deal of evidence about God's action in the natural world. However, just as scientific evidence requires interpretation to have meaning, so too the Bible and church teaching require interpretation. So let me explain what I mean by that. Take the issue of spontaneous generation. The idea that from inanimate objects, life can spontaneously form. For example, think about the example of maggots forming in a bowl of cornmeal. So just hold that in your mind. It's a really beautiful image. Just think about it. For 2,000 years, the dominant scientific interpretation of that observation was that cornmeal and air come together to spontaneously make maggots. It's consistent with the observation. At the same time, early church dogma took a look at biblical passages like the Israelites finding quail in the desert, or Samson finding a beehive in the carcass of a lion, and said, aha, the Bible points to spontaneous generation of life. Everyone agreed. Science and faith were in harmony. It wasn't until the late 19th century that Louis Pasteur came along and showed that, in fact, spontaneous generation is not the normal course of things. And the conclusion from this is not that the original experiments or the scripture are wrong. They are not. The original experiments weren't wrong. They weren't falsified. Maggots really do form. If you leave cornmeal out on the table, you'll get a surprise in a few weeks. And in scripture, people continue to believe that the Israelites did find quail in the desert. The evidence in scripture and the scientific evidence were not wrong, but the interpretation was. Life does not come out of non-life as a matter of course. When that happens, something unusual or even miraculous must have occurred. And so this is what I mean when I say that Scripture requires interpretation. It doesn't stand on its own any more than the observation that maggots form in cornmeal stands on its own. God gave us Scriptures, the ability to reason, and the opportunity to pray. And Christians believe that by judicious application of these three things, we can arrive at truth. And so while I can understand from, reading the popular press how someone might believe that because I am a Christian, it means I have just accepted without thinking some universal doctrine of what Christianity says about faith. But the reality is that my walk as a Christian has consisted much more of, yes, looking at scriptures, yes, praying, but also using reason in order to seek after the truth. So that's the first misperception that I run into. The second one is the idea that faith means ignoring evidence. Here the idea is that faith means believing things in spite of incontrovertible evidence to the contrary. That people of faith are the kind of people who believe the Apollo moon landing was fake, while professional wrestling is real. That faith really amounts to, when confronted with unpleasant or contrary evidence, just covering your eyes and singing, na 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 boo boo, I can't see you. And this is a characterization of one kind of faith. It's called blind faith. And we've, I think, all met people who have this kind of faith. I have a colleague who is an expert in electromagnetic radiation and how it can be used for imaging. And when the government was commissioning the first stealth bombers a number of years back, he was invited down to the Air Force research labs to present on his research. And so he came down and he gave his talk, and at the end, he added a couple of slides just telling them about how, in his opinion, terahertz waves could potentially be used to detect something like a stealth bomber in flight. He thought that the Air Force might be interested to know about this. And at the end of his talk, a 3-star general in the audience stood up and said, "Son, you're mistaken. That plane is invisible." And my colleague backpedaled a little bit and said, "Well, yes, of course, no one had built something like this yet, so they were safe, but in principle, someone could do it." To which the general replied in a very ominous tone, "No, I said the plane is invisible." And now my colleague is very smart. And so he realized that if he was not careful, he was liable to wake up the next day with a very bad headache. And so he quickly said, Oh, I'm sorry. Of course, sir, you're right. It's completely invisible." That is literally blind faith, invisible planes. It's someone defending a position with no evidence and no justification except for to resort to thinly veiled threats. And this is not the kind of faith that God requires or even desires from us. As Thomas Merton once said, faith is a decision, a judgment that is fully and deliberately taken in the light of a truth that cannot be proven. It is not merely the acceptance of a decision that has been made by someone else. Faith does not give us an excuse to ignore unpleasant evidence, because evidence and reason are important components of the Christian faith. Christians believe God left evidence of his action here on earth, and we believe that he expects us to examine that evidence. Indeed, much of the Bible was written expressly for this purpose. The writer of the Gospel of Luke introduces his book by saying, "It seemed good to me, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught." There's all manner of historical evidence for Christianity: the empty tomb, the perseverance of early Christians, the consistency of their testimony. The evidence is there if you want to look for it. It's not incontrovertible, but it exists. And of whether and how science and faith can be productively integrated. How can they work together? How do they work together? How should they work together? And to organize our discussion of this admittedly broad point, I have a visual aid. So I think we have to go ahead too. So there you see it's integration. Notice the integral sign of science and faith. Okay, so then, so we'll go to the next one though. Just wanted to go forward one. There we go. So here we go. Here is my diagram, because there are 3 things that I would love to know about in this life. And those 3 things are the universe, God, and me. And I want to note at this point that this figure is not drawn to scale. But science and faith work together to help us understand each of these different areas of knowledge and also how they relate to each other. And so I want us to focus in integration on 3 questions organized by this diagram. And the 3 questions are: what is God like if he or she exists? How does the universe work? And where do I fit into all of this? And we're going to discuss those 3 questions in turn. So first things first, what is God like? Well, obviously faith has a number of things to say on this subject. You could kind of argue that that's kind of the whole point of faith, to tell us what God is like. But for those who believe that God played a role in the construction of the universe we live in, natural science also provides a tremendous opportunity to learn about God. Because natural science is then the study of God's handiwork. And I would go so far as to say that if you are a scientist and also a Christian, you would be hard-pressed not to feel a sense of wonder at the work of God's hands. As Isaac Newton once said, it is the perfection of God's works that they are all done with the greatest simplicity. He is the God of order and not of confusion. Because while most would say that God is beyond comprehension, yet still the universe offers a useful lower bound on the complexity of God. He needs to be at least as vast and intricate as the universe he has created. And so when I look at how things organize on different levels, from the wonderful strangeness of quantum mechanics at the microscopic level, to the ways that atoms come together to form sophisticated molecules, to the ways that those molecules cooperate to form life, to the way that life lives in a vast galaxy that is in and of itself only one of millions of galaxies in our universe, I get a glimpse of what God is like and how he must operate. Now, granted, as humans, we have the best understanding of God on our own length scale. We know about his concern for people and how they behave, but God is not just a God of people. God is also the God of quarks and quasars as well. And so science and faith both have things to teach us about God. So that's the first question. The second question, how does the universe work? Okay, well, this question is now kind of a gimme for science. Of course, science helps us to understand how the universe works. What is not as clear is what role faith plays in answering this question. Indeed, some would even say that this is a question faith ought to keep its nose out of. Because at best, faith is likely to produce simplistic and incorrect models of the universe that will later be embarrassingly disproven by scientific investigation. But this assumes that there can be only one explanation for a physical phenomenon, and ignores the existence of different layers of meaning. And to illustrate what I mean by this, I'll give you an example. You might ask me, Troy, why is your shirt purple? And I could give you one explanation. I could say, well, my shirt is purple because there's a high concentration of 6,6-dibromo indigo in the fibers that were used to weave the shirt. And I could even attempt to prove that scientific hypothesis by trying to remove the dye from the shirt and showing you that it changes color once I remove the dye. That would be a scientific explanation for why my shirt is purple. Another explanation would be my shirt is purple because my wife thinks I look quite good in purple. Two explanations. Neither one contradicts the other. Neither one is complete in and of itself. They have different layers of meaning. And the interaction of science and faith in describing nature works in precisely this way. For example, I could ask a question like, why do bacteria have flagella? And one explanation would be as follows. Bacteria have flagella because of an evolutionary process. First, the secretory system arose, which led to the development of a protoflagellar filament, which later developed into the flagellum of the eubacteria that we recognize and know today. That would be one explanation. Another explanation would be to say that bacteria have flagella because God wanted them to be able to swim. Two different explanations explaining different levels of meaning of the same phenomenon. And this interaction between science and faith in explaining how the natural world works is far from trivial. I start off with the simple examples to give you the idea, but in the scientific exercise, it's important to recognize that we always go in with a very important assumption. And the assumption that we have is that there is a reason why things are the way they are. We assume that the universe is going to make sense. But why should we assume that it's going to turn out this way? As Einstein once said, the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. The Christian response to this is to say that the universe was created by a rational, personal deity, so we can expect that there is a reason why things are the way they are. There is no observation such that when we ask why, the ultimate answer is just going to be because, or no reason, or just random luck, I guess. And this premise comes to its sharpest point, in my opinion. I could go on at length, but to me, that comes to its sharpest point when we consider quantum mechanics, which is one of my favorite subjects, because in quantum mechanics, there are certain experiments that you can do that quantum mechanics tells us you cannot predict the outcome of the experiment until after you have done the experiment. You can give some probabilistic interpretation. You can say, oh, well, this is the more likely outcome, but you cannot precisely predict the outcome of the experiment. So from a purely scientific point of view, you might ask me a question like, well, why did the neutron spin turn out to be up instead of down? And from a purely scientific perspective, the only reason I could give you is no reason. It's just random chance, completely unpredictable. But the Christian worldview would dictate that even this was not random. That though it is impossible for us to see the outcome of the experiment in advance, there is ultimately a reason it turned out as it did. Because there's nothing random in a world that is orchestrated by a reasonable God. And so science and faith, to me, both have things to teach us about the way the universe works. All right, so now the last question. Where do I fit into all of this? Now, this is a question that science by itself is ill-equipped to answer. Because the central problem is that science can never lead to any kind of truth that addresses me as an individual. Because science is premised on the idea that truth is objective. That is to say that truth is an object that exists separate from its observation by the subject, namely me. Thus, by definition, science divorces truth from the truth seeker. So, for example, in one of the most wonderful passages of Scripture, Jesus teaches his disciples, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." By contrast, the promise of modern science is the somewhat more mundane, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall probably not have any perceptible impact on the way you choose to behave." And this is a challenge that all of academia faces. So I want you to imagine that you're taking an ethics class that focuses on moral rationalism, the idea that the ideas of right and wrong can be developed from rational arguments alone. And so you spend the semester reading people like Plato and Kant and Richard Hare, and you, in class discussion, are able to prove certain directives like it is wrong to lie, and it is wrong to not share what you have with those in need. And you do this using just rational arguments. All right. Now, consider two different final examinations in this class. One consists of a single question, and that question asks you to write an essay that uses moral rationalism to defend the statement, "It is always wrong to lie." I suspect many of us have taken just such a final exam before. Now, I want you to consider an alternative exam, one consisting also of one question, and that question is, in class, we proved that it is wrong to lie and wrong not to share with what you have with those in need. During the course of this semester, how many times have you lied or failed to share what you have with those in need? Grading will be as follows: -1 point for every lie, -5 points for every failure to share, -100 points for lying in response to this question. That would be an uncomfortable class to be in, because we don't expect the things we learn in class to actually change the way we behave. We expect to live our lives and answer the questions, and nary the twain shall meet. So, to my mind, this is a fundamental weakness of a purely scientific worldview because it possesses no power to transform people. And this is the place where faith becomes crucial in science, to transform it from some cold, dead exercise into something that is vibrant and life-giving. But in order to see why we need faith to accomplish this, we first need to recognize that it is our convictions, the things we are absolutely certain of, that govern our behavior. Because if I am going to organize my life around a particular ideal or principle, I want to be certain that it is true. I want to be sure. If I am uncertain, I'll be inclined to wait until all the evidence has come in before I act. But this doesn't work because from a scientific perspective, there's always more evidence I could gather. And so I never decide. Scientific evidence can give us greater and greater and greater confidence in a proposition, but it never gets us all the way across the gap from indecision to certainty. It might leave behind a very small gap. It might leave behind a very large gap, but there's always a gap. The last step from indecision to certainty is always a step of faith. Now, this need not be religious faith. You could have faith in a person, faith in the goodness of humanity, faith in the law of gravity. But making decisions requires faith, because faith is the thing that gives us a framework for making decisions in the light of incomplete evidence. For example, suppose I feel that there is convincing evidence that human activity is contributing significantly to global warming. Now, this is a hypothetical. I'm not trying to make a stance on global warming one way or the other, but just suppose I am convinced. But even though I am convinced, I still drive an SUV. I still leave incandescent light bulbs on at my house when I am not at home. I still fly tens of thousands of miles every year for vacations. In this hypothetical scenario, I would say that I am convinced, but I am not certain. Because if I was certain, I would change the way that I behave. The fact that I persist in activity that I know produces large amounts of carbon dioxide proves one of two things. It proves either that A, I am not sure that what I am doing really contributes to global warming, or B, I am sure, but I happen to be a particularly evil person who does not care about the future of our planet, the security of our country, or the well-being of my children. And I would hope that that dichotomy there illustrates that what I need in that situation is a certainty that has the power to change the way I behave, because I am not perfect. Now, I know that that was shocking to many of you, because up to now you probably thought I was perfect, but no, I'm not perfect. And neither are any of my scientific or religious colleagues. And to my mind, this is the primary argument in favor of Christianity over and above any other framework for deciding how we behave, because Christianity not only gives us the framework for deciding what we should do, it also gives us the means to act according to those decisions. And the means is the person of Jesus Christ. Because as Christians, we're convinced that when we place our faith in Christ, who was raised from the dead, Jesus comes to live in us. And fundamentally, what I believe in is Jesus' power to change me, to change who I am, to make my life different. And let me explain why that is so important to me. In junior high and high school, I was a geek. Now, I know that was shocking to many of you. You're thinking, oh, MIT quantum chemistry professor, and you were a geek in high school, get out of town. But it's true. I was too smart for my own good. I was socially awkward. And to boot, I grew too quickly. So you could count on it that 6 months out of the year, my clothes were going to be too small. And the unfortunate reality is that chicks don't dig tall, scrawny, awkward dudes who don't know how to dress themselves. So in the social structure of my high school, there were the popular kids, and then there were kids like me. And I was one of those unpopular kids who desperately wanted to be cool. And it didn't actually make me all that nice of a person. I would shun the people that I perceived as being lower on the social ladder than me. All the other kids who didn't have enough money to buy all the right clothes, or all the other members of the chemistry Olympiad team, who, in my opinion, were far nerdier than I was. But unfortunately, when I got out of high school, things didn't really change. Because as time went on, I just replaced popularity with any of a host of other ultimate aims. Getting good grades, succeeding in my career, wealth, fame. Because the problem isn't high school or the in-crowd or college or academia. The problem is me. The way that I am, the things that I want, and no matter how hard I work, that's not a problem that I can solve because I am the problem. And theistic naturalism doesn't provide any help here, because if God merely set the universe in motion and then hung out a sign that says, "Be back in 25 billion years," I'm stuck. I am whatever I am. And in fact, most religions are even less help on this point, because they tie our acceptance by God to our performance. Our ability to adhere to a certain set of rules or accomplish a certain set of tasks. Only in Christianity does God provide the means for us to change who we are. Because in Christianity, you don't do good as a means to suck up to God and show him that you're so much better than all the other non-Christians out there. Morality in Christianity isn't a ladder that you have to ascend to draw close to God, because in fact, the whole narrative of Christianity isn't even a narrative of people ascending to draw close to God. Christianity is about a God who came down to us. The same God who set the universe in motion, who gives life and breath to every living thing, that same God sent to us the means of our redemption in Jesus. And only in Christianity does God take our ability to love, our capacity to reason, and our profound tendency to screw things up and mix it together to make something beautiful. And to me, this theistic Christian worldview provides the most satisfying context in which to understand how I fit into the universe and God's plan for that. And so I'm looking forward to our discussion. I think we have a lot to talk about, but before I take your questions, I wanted to give you guys one more anecdote about the importance of nuance and layers of meanings in question. There was once a father and his daughter who went hiking. And as they were hiking, when night fell, they set up camp and went to sleep. And sometime in the middle of the night, the father woke up and looked over at his daughter, and he saw that she was looking up at the heavens, and he said, "Are you looking up at the stars?" And she said, "Uh-huh." "Dad, what does that tell you?" And so the father, very excited, said, "Well, looking at the billions and billions of stars, I see that they all obey the universal law of gravitation." And the daughter said, "Uh-huh." So the father was a bit crestfallen and tried again. He said, "Well, when I look at that constellation over there, I see from its inclination relative to the horizon that it's about 3:30 in the morning." "Uh-huh." So the father tried one more time. He said, "Well, from the order of the motion of the astronomical bodies and the fine-tuning of the constants, I see that the Lord created a universe that was specifically tailored for life. In short, that God created the whole universe so that you and I could live in it." The daughter paused for a moment and said, "Dad, do you know what it tells me? It tells me somebody stole our tent." Thank you very much.
Let's start off with a couple questions, and then we'll go for a while, and we'll see how it goes. So first of all, you mentioned a couple times miracles. How could miracles possibly work with the laws of physics and chemistry and other things if miracles are totally outside that realm?
Yeah, so I guess so miracles are an interesting question. So again, there's differing definitions of what you would mean by a miracle. So to some extent, you could look at some miracles and say, okay, well, is a miracle only something that violates the laws of nature as we know them? Or is a miracle just something that's really, 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 really unlikely to happen, but doesn't actually violate the laws of nature? I would say that in practice, most people use the word miracle for the second meaning. In other words, it's not necessarily that it violates the laws of nature, it just seems really, really, really unlikely that it would happen. And in that scenario, I would say that, again, it comes down to a question of the differences of layers of interpretation. Because you could look at something that's a famous miracle, like Moses parting the Red Sea. And you could say, well, you might be able to actually, if you assume that actually happened, you might say, well, there might actually be a mechanistic explanation for why that happened. There might have been an earthquake. It might have been that somewhere the inlet for the water that came in was stopped, and therefore the sea actually dried up for a little while and then came in. You can come up with, hypothetically, any number of ways that technically could have happened. Pretty unlikely that they were going to happen at exactly the moment that Moses needed them to happen, but mechanistically doesn't violate the laws of nature. And yet still, most people would call that a miracle if you stood by the edge of the sea and all of a sudden it just dried up. And so the question of miracles is really much more of one of saying, can we see some kind of deeper purpose or some kind of deeper meaning behind events that would otherwise seem as just very, very improbable, blue moon events? That would be my take on what miracles are like.
Okay. We have a question here on the origin of life. What are your thoughts on the origin of the universe? If God created the universe, who created God?
Yes, okay. So my thoughts on the origin of the universe, that's a rather vague question.
That's how we like them.
Yeah, so I can answer the second question. If God created the universe, who created God? I don't know. You can ask, epistemologically, does it really save us that much to say, okay, well, we get to the beginning of the universe, we don't know how the universe started, so we invent God. God started the universe, and they say, well, where did God start? But to some extent, the question of, what came before God or who created God, I think is an ill-formed question because it assumes that time is an aspect of God, whereas time is quite clearly an aspect of creation, of the universe that was made. So people struggle with these ideas of God being eternal or existing at all times or knowing the future. Those are kind of really poorly phrased questions. The correct way to think about things is to think that God doesn't really have time, that time was something that was created for this universe and for us. And so, it's as to saying, well, who created God? Well, that sort of presumes that God experiences time in the sense that there could have been a time before when God was. And if there's no time for him, then who knows? In terms of the beginning of the universe, I'm not a cosmologist, so my opinions on the beginning of the universe are entirely gotten from watching Carl Sagan on TV, and so I don't know that I'm really all that much of an expert on these things to say, oh well, this is really how it happened. You should trust me. So I'll refrain from making any poorly phrased scientific or religious points that might lead people astray on that.
Okay. All right. Is morality really dependent on religion? There's many societies who have done well on their own outside religion, but just in the aspects of philosophy.
Yep. So I think there's sort of 2 points that I would try to make there. So one is I could have added in a misperception about faith that, given infinite amount of times I could have. There is an argument that's out there that says that you can't have morality without God. You can't be good without God. I think that's not true. You certainly can come up with moral codes based on, for example, rational arguments, or there are various ways to construct philosophy.
You mentioned interpretation of the Bible earlier. Who decides how to interpret the Bible? How do conflicting personal perceptions affect interpersonal confidence in decision-making of interpretation?
Yeah. So in terms of who decides, I think it depends on, what tradition you come from. There are certainly some people who would say that there is some hierarchical structure in the church, that, someone higher in the church decides, and then you have to accept their decision. I don't come from that type of church tradition. I come from a tradition that says, I decide, I get to decide what I think is right about the interpretation of Scripture. I mean, I have a responsibility to listen to what other people have to say, but ultimately I am the arbiter of my decisions about Scripture because I'm the only person who's responsible for my own soul. Now, in terms of how, if I have one interpretation of Scripture and hypothetically you have a different interpretation, how do we actually, we definitely do, we're way far apart. How do we actually come together? Well, I mean, I would say that it's not really any different than saying, well, what if I'm a Republican and you're a Democrat? How do we actually have a civil discussion about politics when we come from such different points of view? Are we both Americans or not? I certainly think that, there can be very uncivil discourses on both subjects, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be that way. I think it is certainly possible to have civil discourses even when there is disagreement over the interpretation of Scripture. It doesn't always happen that way, unfortunately.
Okay. I'm going to read this whole question because it's pretty funny. Wonderful lecture. But with all due respect, if God created the unpredictable universe, who are we to figure it out? And even if we do figure it out, at the end, does it really matter?
So, I mean, I think to describe the universe as unpredictable that's not actually how I view the universe. There is a large fraction of the universe that is very predictable. And a large fraction of the things that we can't predict, I would say, are really only unpredictable because we have a finite amount of knowledge about the initial conditions of the system. That if I knew more about how things were starting, there would be even more things that I could predict. And so in terms of whether, why should we think that we're able to predict an unpredictable universe, I don't necessarily see the universe as all that unpredictable. Now, in terms of whether it matters or not, that's a question of what do you mean does it matter? Does it matter in the sense, I think it matters in the sense that what I do, I feel like, it's detective work, it's figuring things out, and, to some extent, I do feel joy in doing what I do, and discovering new things, and finding them out, and solving problems. And I think that joy is a gift from God, the joy in discovering new things and trying things out. Does it matter in the sense of, are we going to save humanity or do something great to the universe if we figure something out? It's not a puzzle in that sense. If you're having trouble in your physics class, don't worry, it's okay. It doesn't matter on that level.
Okay. If God is a God of order, why is entropy always increasing?
Aha! It's an excellent, excellent chemistry question. So here I can actually really, I punted on cosmology because I don't know much about cosmology, but I know a lot about entropy. So entropy is the perfect example of how our incomplete knowledge affects our predictions. Entropy is really just a measure of our incompleteness, the incompleteness of our knowledge of the state of the system. So entropy is a measure of the amount of disorder that's consistent with the observations we've made. And the more restraints and constrictions you place on the system, you reduce the entropy of the system. And the increase in entropy is really just more of is just an observational statement of saying, well, as time goes on, if we don't specify anything about the system, if we don't constrain anything, then the number of states that are available to the system increases, and so the entropy increases. But that's not necessarily a physical law in the sense, I think sometimes we call entropy disorder or randomness or something like that, and that's qualitatively correct, but it's really only disorder and randomness based on, at least, at a fundamental level, the way I would understand it, based on the incompleteness of our knowledge about the system. And so, for example, if we were, infinitely knowledgeable and we knew everything would look ordered, and there wouldn't necessarily even be such a concept as entropy for us.
Okay, we'll let you have that one. Okay. Do we call some unknown power of the universe God because of our imagination or because we replace something we don't know to God?
So this again, this then ties back to, where does our origin of the concept of God come from? Is it just a projection of something we've experienced, or is it just filling, I think in terms of whether it's filling in something we don't know, I think that is, again, getting close to this idea of the God of the gaps. I don't think of God as something that fills in just the piece that we don't know, that sort of nebulous bit, because that sort of suggests that, oh, well, then if I learned a little bit more, then my idea of God would disappear. And all of the sociological studies suggest that things are not the case, that's not the case, that in fact it's, that the sort of concept of God and the belief in God is very persistent, even when you get to very high levels of learning and study. If you have a belief in God, it's very robust. It's not as if it gets disproven by learning enough. Now, as to the flip side of saying, okay, so it was whether or not it was something that we don't know, and then the other one was, is it just sort of a projection of things that we've seen? I think there is something, there are some philosophical arguments about this. I think that Freud was one of the people who really articulated this well. He said, okay, well, believing in God is really just a kind of wish fulfillment. God is the embodiment of all things good and pure and true, and, the boogeyman is bad, and so we want God. But, I don't think that, that certainly could be the criticism of certain kinds of characterization of God. I don't think it's a very accurate characterization of the Christian perception of God, because the Christian perception of God isn't really wish fulfillment. I mean, there's all these kinds of really inconvenient injunctions in Christianity about not stealing and giving to the needy and caring for your parents and looking out for people and loving your neighbor and forgiving them. Lots of these really unpleasant things that you have to do. And if it was wish fulfillment, you would just leave them out. You would just say, well, why don't we just make the rules eat chocolate? And that's not the way that God is conceived. So you could certainly retrodict and say, well, there's some other conception that's being projected, but I think the Christian conception of God is sufficiently complex and many-faceted that thinking of it as just a projection of some sort of monist idea from our souls is probably selling it short a bit.
What is the most difficult concept for you to personally reconcile between faith and religion?
The most difficult concept to reconcile. Well, I guess I'll say, I would say probably the most difficult thing for me to reconcile in faith is belief in the afterlife. I mean, I do believe that there is a life after death, but that certainly does seem awful convenient. That, we die and then we just keep living, even though you can't see it and everybody seems to die. That to me is is a difficult thing to swallow. That does seem pretty tough. And whenever I come back to this, I've gone over this many times. Okay, well, what if it's not really true, and so forth. And the thing that I always come back to is that if God is good, and if he is just, there are things that happen in this life that are not good and that are not just, and that there must be something more. There must be some place where those good and just things exist. So there must be something more than just this. And now, whether or not that's exactly, whether I know exactly what that is, I can't say, but I always come back to that idea that, okay, well, there's got to be something more, and at least I can hold on to that. But that's the thing that probably when I wrestle with faith and the scientific point of view, which says, well, a body dies, it stays dead. That's probably the hardest thing for me to reconcile on a regular basis.
Okay. How can I be sure that I'm something more than a neural network of electrochemical signals? I think this person wants to know if they have a soul.
Yeah, yep. So they say, how can I be sure that I'm not just a bunch of neurological signals? So, I think that this gets back to the question of, so for someone who's, not a person of faith, and I say, well, I have faith in something. I think it's difficult to understand. It's difficult for people who aren't people of faith to understand what I mean when I say that. I think sometimes they think that I never have any doubts about things. That, I just somehow have this overwhelming, good, warm and fuzzy feeling inside me that keeps me sure all the time. And that's not the case. Faith coexists with doubt. So if I have a question like this, how do I know that I'm not just some biological machine, a very sophisticated biological machine? And in the end, what I say is, the way that I express my certainty in this is not by saying I never have any doubts, not by having some feeling inside of me, not by, the fact that my brain can't come up with any way that could be true. The way I express my certainty in that is in the way that I behave. Because I don't behave as if you are just biological machines. I behave as if you are people. And I behave as if I am a person. I behave as if your lives have purpose and meaning and as if mine does. And I yet to meet very many people who actually behave as if we are just machines. And if you were really certain that you were just a collection of neural circuitry, I think your behavior could be consistent with that. But no one is really quite certain of that. And yet I behave in a way that makes it seem that I am quite certain that we are more. So to say, how can I be sure? I would say that you probably already are sure.
But wouldn't evolutionary sociology cause us to want to live a certain way that would cause our family to continue, or our kind or whatever to continue?
Yes. So this is a philosophical point that's been brought up a few times. It's the idea that, okay, how do we know that evolution didn't engineer us to believe that we're real people, to believe in God, whatever? And certainly, from a scientific point of view, you could say that might be true. But if that is true, how do we know that evolution didn't engineer us to be deceived into believing that evolution would make us, you see what I'm saying? That, that if I can question my own brain because of evolutionary purposes, can't I question your brain for suggesting an argument that I should question my brain? You sort of turn the scalpel onto, okay, well, turn the scalpel onto God. Well, let me turn the scalpel back onto the skeptical argument, because we have to come from the premise that the thoughts that we have and the feelings that we have are real. Because if we don't have that premise, we don't have anything to talk about. Because otherwise, everything's thrown into question. You can't believe anything. Why have a discussion? And so, certainly that's an argument that you could make, but I think it's an argument that leads to a pretty non-intellectual place.
If there is one God, but everyone's perception of things is different, doesn't it mean that every individual's God is different? If that is true, what is this one God in religion? I think there's many religions.
Yeah, so there's a couple of different questions there, or a couple of different things that I can see sort of wrestling around in that question. One is the idea that if there's many perceptions of God, but there's only one God, is there still really one God, or are there many gods? And I think this gets back to the question of, okay, well, does God change because my perception or my understanding of God changes? And my contention would be no, that, whatever divine being to this question also, I'm going to waffle, but on purpose. And that's because, there's people that have a very large range of viewpoints on how creation, intelligent design, evolution, how all these things come together in terms of explaining the existence of life on Earth. And I think they all have their viewpoints. I think the most important thing for all of these is that we approach the debate with our heads turned on, so reason, and also with an appreciation for the opposing point of view, for learning where they're coming from and what they are saying, and trying to evaluate if there's any kernel of truth in what they are saying. So for the people who maybe come from a very religious background, who aren't as familiar with science, it's important for you to familiarize yourself with the science so that you're not just, religious fanatics who don't know anything about science, who are off sort of trying to usurp the scientific arguments. And for scientists who don't have a huge religious background, it's important for you to actually figure out why religious people get so angry about scientists trying to promote particular scientific views, and trying to understand why that viewpoint is so offensive to some people, and figuring out where the middle ground is. And I think having those kinds of discussions are far more important than actually arriving at, okay, this is the exact timeline from the origin of the universe to now, this is exactly how we think it happened. I think it's much more important that we learn how to think than on that particular issue that we come to, a universal textbook description of what's happened.
Where do you find your certainty in faith in Christ? Because you said that certainty can't exist.
I said that certainty can't exist based on just scientific evidence. So, what time is it? I don't even know.
We'll have one more question.
Oh, one more question after this one. Okay, so, So, where do I find my certainty in my faith in Christ? Well, so I guess I'll go ahead and give the honest answer to this, which will probably cause me to lose a little bit of credibility, which is why I wanted to know how much time I had left, so that, if we only have one more question, how much credibility can I lose? So, for me, I was raised as a Christian, and then I stopped going to church. I stopped believing when I was in college, and for most of graduate school. And when I was in graduate school, during this time of non-belief, there was one day where I firmly believed that God spoke to me. And, he had some things to say to me, which I didn't particularly like at the time. But it wasn't just, oh, well, God spoke to me in some abstract way. I really felt that I had a conversation with God as a person. And that's where I feel like, you could probably lose some credibility. You think, this guy's nuts. But that's my experience. And for me, I was raised as a Presbyterian. And so for those of you who don't know about Presbyterians, God doesn't often speak to Presbyterians. And so this was an unusual occurrence for me. And it definitely drove home to me the idea of a God who is not a theistic God who lives apart from the universe, but one who actually does intervene in the course of the universe in targeted ways. And so for me, that was, when I'm shaken to my core and doubting lots of things, that's probably the one thing that I most come back to. So.
Do you have any examples or facts in history or science that more so prove the validity of the Bible?
That prove the validity of the Bible. Well, so the difficulty here is, this is a talk about science and faith. I haven't really set up what would be the parameters by which you would say, I prove that the Bible is valid, because the Bible is not really a scientific document. It might be a historical document, it might be a legal document. They didn't really have the concept of science 2,000 years ago when the most recent parts of the Bible were being written. And so we would have to come up with some type of a hermeneutic for evaluating, well, how do we prove the validity of a scriptural claim? But in terms of, me saying, okay, here's a historical fact that really suggests the Bible is true. I mean, let's take a look, for example, at the resurrection of Christ. So most Christians would claim that this was a historical event, and that it was really central to the foundation of Christianity. And you might say, well, how do we know that this really happened? Well, the best evidence I think that you can give for this is there were 12 really close friends, the disciples that Jesus had. And every one of those 12 people, save the one who betrayed him, went to their death saying that Jesus rose from the dead. They were all threatened with death, and they all said, fine, I'm not going to yield. Jesus rose from the dead. And if this was made up, if it didn't really happen, if it was a story, I would have thought that one of them would have recanted, like Lance Armstrong, right? They would have held on for a long time and then eventually said, okay, fine, you're right, I made it up. But not one of them did. And that tells me that something happened. Now, what exactly that was, they would interpret as the resurrection of Christ. Again, there might be mechanistic explanations for what exactly happened, but something very important happened there. And it wasn't just made up, it wasn't retrodicted, it wasn't anything like that. That something happened there. So there are various illustrations of that kind of the validity of claims in the Bible, but that's one that I would offer.
Well, thanks for asking our questions. Thanks for letting me read these. I'm going to pass it off to Justin, who's going to end the show.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.